Thank you very much, Sue, and thank you very much, Leslie. Really appreciate being hosted by the Milwaukee Shambhala Center and Windhorse Retreat Center. And good evening to all of you. Welcome. Great to see such a large audience here this evening. And I want to, to begin with, really express tremendous thanks and gratitude to Mr. Alan Anderson, who's back in the back there, without whom this wouldn't have happened. He's worked very hard on, in really kind of short notice to, originally we were going to do a program out at the retreat center, and he wanted to do, he felt given what's going on in our world right now, he wanted to do something here in Milwaukee where we could gather a larger group of people and have a dialogue with each other, a conversation with each other about how to be in relation to what's going on right now. So thank you very much, Alan. And so again, welcome. I'm very happy to be here. It's been a while. I did a program here some 7-8 years ago, I think. And it's great to be back in Milwaukee. I was in Wisconsin just, sometimes lose track of time, last year. I think it was last summer. And I did this seminar that I lead all over the world called Radical Responsibility. I did that there, but I also did an evening talk with Richie Davidson, who many of you may know. He's a colleague of mine and a renowned neuroscientist who's chosen to focus his career not only studying the neuroscience of our emotional life as human beings, but in particular the impact of mindfulness practice on human development and the quality of our lives and how we show up in the world and so forth. And very important work that goes on at UW over there in Madison. So I just want to give you a little quick background, a thumbnail sketch of where I'm coming from. Grew up in the Midwest. I'm from St. Louis originally. Middle class Roman Catholic family. Very early on, felt like somebody had dropped me in the wrong neighborhood on the wrong planet. Lovely people, my family, my parents, but somehow like, who are you and what am I doing here? And so I struggled, and but you know, I had basically a good upbringing and a good education, mixed in with a lot of family alcoholism and the usual dysfunctional family stuff, and was very ripe for the counterculture when it came along, and went headlong into that. And both as a spiritual seeker and as a practitioner of general sort of craziness, and became very alienated politically and socially, culturally, and left the country after our wonderful President Nixon was reelected for a second term. I had it and left the country and lived an expat for a number of years in South America and fell into kind of small-time drug smuggling. I'd been involved in the drug world for a long time as a practitioner, an enthusiast. And it was not something I'm particularly proud of, but it was something to do with the times, I guess. And anyway, I fell into small-time drug smuggling as a way to continue to live outside the culture, and justified it with all this us versus them thinking, and feeling like the whole world's hypocritical, and you know, I'm right, they're wrong, and had all these justifications to be involved in what was essentially really harmful activity. But at any rate, I was also a spiritual seeker, continued that, and so along the way, explored a lot of paths, and engaged in a lot of kind of shamanic work in South America, and came back, got a master's degree in contemplative psychotherapy, and found my teacher Trungpa Rinpoche, and a lot of positive things, a lot of deep things, and still all this shadow stuff going on in my life, and then ended up in a federal prison for 14 years after having done all that training, had a master's degree, and trained with Trungpa Rinpoche for 10 years. And so it was kind of an interesting confluence of causes and conditions. Here I was in this complete hell realm, and I worked hard to get there. And I realized that I had gotten myself there, but I had a lot of training. I had a lot of experience, and so that was the wake-up call for me, finally. And initially, the biggest part of it was that really the impact on my son, who was 9 years old at the time, who was now going to grow up without his dad. And that's what, more than anything else, finally woke me up. And I was absolutely devastated, went through a kind of dark night of the soul experience. I became radically dedicated to doing something with my life that my son could maybe be proud of, other than just that his dad went to prison, or maybe even that his dad died in prison, because I had no surety that I was really originally sentenced to 30 years with no parole. It was reduced to 25 years with no parole after my appeal. Took my appeal about 3 years to go through the courts, and they knocked off 5 years. And then under the old federal law, you got a lot of good time, especially if you had a long sentence. So if you stayed out of trouble, you got good time. And so eventually, I served 14 years. Today on the same sentence, they got rid of that good time. Today on the same sentence in the federal system, you'd serve on 25 years, you'd serve at least 21. And the only thing that could get you out of that would be a presidential pardon, which are not forthcoming. And even from President Clinton when I was in prison. And so anyway, that was quite a journey. And I've been out since '99, and I feel very grateful that I've had tremendous opportunities ever since I got out to serve, and I travel around the world doing sort of contemplative-based social action and social justice work. And I'm very grateful for my teachers and the confidence that they've placed in me. And so that's a little bit of the context of kind of how I got here. I would like to really focus this evening on what we're all going through together right now. Kind of probably what's most immediately present for us is these intense weather calamities. And I didn't get a chance to check the news in the last few hours, but I assume it's hitting Florida now. Hurricane Irma is about to, and maybe tomorrow morning. Okay, and there's tremendous damage already, and of course we know what happened with Harvey. And a friend of mine sent me an email yesterday. Somebody put together this thing that showed these extreme weather disasters and fires and things that are going on all over the world right now. Tremendous suffering. My dear friend Roshi Joan Halifax, who's founder of the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and been doing amazing work since way back in the 60s, a pioneer in the conscious living and dying movement and deep ecology movement and Zen and socially engaged Buddhism and so many things. And she's in Nepal right now. She's been going to Nepal and Tibet every year, leading this thing called the Nomad Clinic, where she takes a group of doctors and nurses and other clinicians up into the most remote places in Nepal and Tibet to bring medical care to the nomads. And so they arrived in, they weren't even sure they were going to be able to enter Nepal, because Nepal has been having terrible floods throughout Nepal and Pakistan, horrendous floods from monsoons right now, and tremendous suffering, on top of what's been going on there for the last 2-3 years of earthquakes and political instability and all kinds of things. And so anyway, they were able to get in. The airport was opened, and I'm still not sure how they were going to get to where they were, because their trek this year happens on really near the Chinese border of Nepal and China. And to get to the base camp of where they begin trekking, and they go up to the most remote areas, and they have, it's a group of about 50 Westerners and about 100 Nepalese support team that they've been working with for the last 15 years that help, and they go with this huge caravan, get up in these areas, and so they weren't sure how they were going to get there. They might have to helicopter in because of airports being closed. But at any rate, having arrived in Nepal, what was happening right there in front of their eyes was refugees coming in from Burma with the Rohingya people who are being victims of ethnic cleansing right now by the Buddhist majority in Burma, in Myanmar, and similar to some of the stuff. As many of us, the Shambhala tradition is a Buddhist tradition, and many of us who are Buddhists are proud of the fact that Buddhism hasn't been as involved in, violence and warfare as some of our great religious traditions have, unfortunately. It's a human problem, not really a religious problem, but nonetheless, we've kind of been, but still, even us Buddhists, we have our problems. Sri Lanka, tremendous violence by Buddhist majority against the Tamil, and in Burma, violence by the Buddhist majority against the minority Rohingya people who are Muslims. And so, just so many things going on in the world right now, and here in our own country, it's kind of the one grateful thing. I tend to get my news online from CNN mostly. I try to explore a few other things, but I try not to be a news junkie because you know what that does to your brain. But the only, it's a weird feeling, like these terrible storms that are creating so much suffering for people, and I've been feeling that all day of just feeling just the sadness and pain of that people are having their lives destabilized in such horrendous ways, and in terms of the kind of news thing that we deal with and the news cycle, the only thing that has pushed President Trump off the news cycle is these storms, and of course also the whole thing, the aftermath of Charlottesville and all the rest of it, and all the craziness that's going on. And I'm not here to demonize Mr. Trump at all, President Trump, but just it seemed like the drumbeat of this constant political thing was all the news, and it's kind of a relief that actually the news is paying attention to something right now that's actually a bit more human in some way. Human beings struggling because of natural weather disasters. Well, we're not so sure how natural they are, but anyway, they're happening. So there's all this going on, but I do really want to bring us back to what happened in Charlottesville, which is really just symptomatic of a lot of things, as heartbreaking as it was and as impactful as it has been for many of us, because I do want to bring that into our hearts and minds, and focus tonight on how do we respond to what's going on in our world today. I think it brings up a lot of uncertainty and a lot of confusion for a lot of us. I don't really. Well, let's find out. I was about to say I don't really know who's in the room tonight, but let's find out. So how many people here have some kind of meditation practice or some kind of experience with meditation? So a great deal of you, the majority of you. How many people here have some prior connection with the Shambhala tradition in the Milwaukee Shambhala Center? About half, maybe. Mm-hmm. How many people here self-identify as Buddhist? Good number. I suspect, anyway, that it seems like the majority of us have some connection to some kind of contemplative life and spiritual life and meditation, and we probably share some common values of nonviolence and strong ethical context, and really abhorring the presence of racism still in our society, and all the other isms and prejudices and ways that people suffer because of being different than whatever the dominant uh, um, ethnicities or races or genders or gender expressions or sexual orientations are. And so I imagine we have a lot of shared values here in this room. And also because of we're probably all peace-loving people. And so I would imagine, that many of us find ourselves, and I don't want to speak for anybody here, I'm just throwing some stuff out here, and then eventually I'm going to open up and we're going to have a little bit of a dialogue. But I think a lot of us who are more contemplatively oriented and peace-loving, sometimes we really want to be for things. We'd like to be for compassion, for inclusiveness, for community, for love, for peace. And we're not quite as comfortable being against things, right? Against just seems a little harsher, a little, and yet, it's hard to back away, especially when it rears its ugly head, to not be against or want to take a stand against racism and hatred and hate speech and various forms of aggression. And in terms of Charlottesville, with the seeming resurgence of this white nationalism and white supremacy and hate speech and racism that surrounds it, it's hard not to want to be against that and take a stand against it. But then how do we do that without becoming divisive and polarized and full of hate ourselves and full of aggression ourselves? And how do we do that as people who are peace-loving and value contemplative values and principles? Or many of us who maybe perhaps in the meditative traditions that we're part of, in the Buddhist tradition, Shambhala tradition in particular, or Hindu traditions or other Sufi, Siddha Yoga traditions, where we value some kind of non-dual context. We live in the relative world. We honor the truth of the relative world, but also the background or underlying truth of non-duality and non-separateness. And we don't want to just fall into this dualistic, very divisive, polarized enemy making, right? And so it leaves us in a tough position, especially when things are going on, right, very much in our face and in our communities that have been going on. In Charlottesville, again, was like a flashpoint and a symptomatic flashpoint of what has been going on. The police violence against young men of color that's been going on for so long. And, it's been going on forever, but our awareness of it has been really heightened in recent years. The terrible, one of the ones that really got a lot of attention, fortunately, early on, was one that happened in St. Louis. And that's where I'm from. And in fact, my great-grandparents lived in the very neighborhood where that happened. And I was traveling in Europe when it happened, and I was really struck when I saw the name. That's like, I used to visit my great-grandparents there. And my parents have been gone quite a long time, but I have an older brother and 3 sisters who still live in St. Louis. And they live out in the suburbs, and they're, white, middle class, relatively affluent, not super wealthy, but relatively affluent people that live out in the suburbs. And I went home to see them, as I often do at Thanksgiving or Christmas. I think this time it was Christmas. And I was, just kind of taking the temperature of what was happening there. And it was basically fear, a lot of fear. And I remember growing up in St. Louis, I happened to be on vacation with my family when I was very young in LA when the Watts riots happened. And in St. Louis that was 65, in St. Louis in 66 and 67 we had terrible riots and a lot of fear. And what I sensed among my family was that same kind of fear I remember from back then, that white people who live in the suburbs, the kind of fear they have. I was really trying to figure out a way to engage them in conversation, but I don't think I was skillful enough to do it. But I mainly wanted to sense where they were, and but it felt very personal and very tragic to have that happening in this place that's not my primary home, but still some quality of home for me. So all this has been going on, and it's very painful for all of us and for everyone. So how do we respond? How do we deal with it? I've been doing a series of evening talks like this in cities in the U.S. and Canada under the title Beyond Enemies. So I'd like to take that as a starting point this evening and see where it goes. The one I've been doing is called Beyond Enemies, Sacred Outlook and Social Transformation. So in the Shambhala tradition, there's a word from the Tibetan language, and for those of you who are not that familiar with Shambhala, Shambhala is very connected to Tibetan Buddhism, and we talk about Shambhala Buddhism, but actually it's an integration of two kind of parallel, very ancient traditions, both the overall Buddhist path, as well as the particular Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhist path, and this ancient Shambhala tradition, which is an ancient Asian tradition of contemplative or spiritually based warriorship. And warriorship in the sense of human bravery, not in the sense of aggression or violence. And so the word drala is often translated as transcending enemy or beyond enemy or above enemy. So dra means enemy and la means above enemy. And so it's very connected to what I was mentioning before in terms of this idea of non-separateness or non-duality. And it's connected to our innate ability as human beings to connect to our own hearts and experience the world in a way in which we don't feel so separate from the world or so separate from others or even separate from ourselves. And we experience what we call in the Shambhala tradition basic goodness, the innate wholeness, integrity, goodness of our fundamental humanity, or what in the Buddhist tradition is called Buddha nature, or in other traditions might be called Christ nature, or divinity, or Krishna nature, or just sacredness. And that when we're in touch with that quality in our being, we don't perceive the world as so separate from ourselves. And we experience the world actually from the Buddhist and the Shambhala perspective, we actually begin to experience the world as it really is. And as a very vivid and fluid and alive and it's sort of, most of you are meditators, or maybe everybody in the room is a meditator. You probably had the experience of being at a meditation program, an all-day program, maybe a multi-day retreat of some kind, and maybe at tea break or lunch or something, you stepped outside after doing a lot of practice, and suddenly the world just kind of, jumped out at you. The colors were so vivid, and the flowers, and it's because, our mind is relaxed somewhat, and it's clearing, and we're not so caught up in all the dualistic discursiveness and separateness and stuff, and we see the world as it really is, which is really magical. And one of the ways we talk about that often is a sense of sacredness. And so that's this idea of sacred outlook. And when we have sacred outlook and we look out at humanity, what do we see? We see sacred beings. We see Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, everywhere. And we don't see any non-Buddhas, right? We don't see any non-sacred beings. So that's this idea of sacred outlook and drala, or beyond enemy. The term drala itself, sometimes we talk about drala actually as almost like kind of spiritual entities of some kind. Like if you're familiar with in the Japanese tradition the term kami, and people have heard that. Like in Japan and in Shintoism, every stream, every mountain has its kami. It's kind of the various human traditions that really are connected to the earth and connected to nature and spiritually grounded. And many indigenous traditions throughout the world have this sense of recognizing the animated, the very alive quality of the natural world, and realize that those are not just rocks over there. These are alive presence and beings, and that every place has its energy, its own magic, its own sacredness, and we can tune into these beings and this presence of aliveness in our world. And all human traditions have recognized this and have different names for it. So there's a quality of drala. So sometimes we talk about the dralas, and we can actually connect with the dralas, and they can be very helpful to us. And we can lead our life in a way that attracts the dralas, and that can be a tremendous support to us. Or sometimes we talk about drala more like it's just quality of energy, like that vividness of the world, that when we connect with our own basic goodness and our mind relaxes and we look out into the world, it kind of shines and shimmers, right? Or we look at other people and we see, not necessarily saying we see their aura, but maybe we do. We see some quality, that there's a certain luminosity to life and a certain vividness, and we live in this energetic world and we tune into it more. So the same thing that we talk about as basic goodness in ourselves, when we think of that environmentally in the world, we think about it as drala, right? So it may or may not get clear where I'm going with all this in a moment or two. When you're there, eyeball to eyeball with your supposed enemy, if you're experiencing your own basic goodness and their basic goodness and the sacredness of the environment you're in, and it's a little hard to hold on to the enemy thing, right? You really have to work at it. Now, I'm not being naive here. That person may be doing a good job of showing up as your enemy. They may have a club in their hand or something, And I'm not saying that we shouldn't protect ourselves and protect others and protect our loved ones. And those are very personal decisions we all have to make when we're under really serious physical threat, or our family or our community is under physical threat. But nonetheless, we get into a lot of enemy making where it hasn't quite got to that point yet. Interestingly, in Charlottesville, I'm going to say some things tonight that on the face of it may be a little controversial, so I invite you all to be a little patient with me and a little open-minded. But when things like that happen, it's real easy to fall into a particular view or a particular camp where we immediately feel comfortable, because others will go, okay, you're saying the right things, you're using the right language, you're using the right keywords, you're one of us, you're okay, right? And that could be in a number of different camps in relation to that kind of thing. And, even though it's understandable where the language of all those different sort of views and camps come from, and comes out of genuine human suffering, and it's not that these things are not valid, don't have their validity, but to the extent that they become places where we reside to feel comfortable. Like now, I'm at least part of one of the groups. I have a group that I can be with, and they all agree. They say the same words, they have the same, I don't know that it particularly leads anywhere ultimately. So I'm going to say some things that might not fit into some of those views perfectly, or some of those nice boxes perfectly. Who knows? I mean, it seems like because of our current president's posture on things and what he's vocalized and different things, that it's created somewhat of a resurgence of this KKK, white nationalism, white supremacy. They've kind of come out of the woodwork a bit, as we know. And it's not like they haven't been there all along. But I was reading something. I don't know. I was doing some research on some of these things related, and I saw that when was this? Before World War II, but Hitler was already in power in Germany. There was a group of American white Nazi sympathizers who did a rally with 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden in New York. That was America. Madison Square Garden in New York. And I saw the pictures of it. And they had, it looked like the pictures we've seen from Germany. They had all the symbols and the stuff, and it was, so this stuff has, been around for a long time. And, fortunately, it seemed like especially some of the worst manifestations of the Ku Klux Klan and the terrorism that they perpetuated on African Americans in particular for generations has been suppressed for a while. And to see it come back out, I think, was terrifying to all of us. And so, that seems like kind of what's happening. These groups have been a bit emboldened, maybe by the way the president has postured himself. But also, what else is going on there? Can we look at these people and see their basic goodness and see them as human beings who are manifesting this way for some reason? Or do we just fall into they are an implacable enemy and we have to go annihilate them? It's very interesting to see I was an anti-Vietnam War protester, and I remember showing up when I was at the University of Missouri and the Cambodian invasion, and my roommate and I, who were both pretty crazy, we were already IV drug users, and I was completely radicalized, and I was pretty out there on all levels, politically, culturally, and another couple of years I left the country. But Cambodian invasion, we shut down the campus. My roommate, my housemate, a guy named John, showed up and with a helmet on, a football helmet on, and shoulder pads, and a baseball bat. And they had phalanxes of police in riot gear, what that looks like there. And I'm standing next to John, and he's wearing a helmet and a baseball bat. I'm going, good luck, John. I was a protester, but I wasn't quite that crazy. But on the other hand, I was fortunate that I didn't grow up in the East Coast somewhere. I'm sure I would have ended up in the SDS or the Weather Underground or something and blown up buildings. Because actually, they finally got us to not shut down the campus. They got the students to do this or that. And with a small group, I tried to lead them into going into more radical stuff. And we wanted to blow up the local ROTC building or something. And I was pretty crazy back then. And I was full of testosterone. I was 20, 21 years old. So, I can well understand a lot of the young activists today that's been going on at various protests around the NAFTA agreement, and now coming out around these counter protests against the white nationalists, coming out the Black Bloc and the other protesters, and coming up and showing up at the rallies with their protective gear and the clubs and so forth. And I get it on a certain level, and I could be there myself. I've often said over the last few years, when the Occupy movement was happening, if I was a 20-year-old today, I would have more reason to be pissed off than I did when I was a 20-year-old in 1970, because things are even more corrupt. And we've got wars going on everywhere, and Wall Street has completely corrupted our society and taken. If you want to get me on my, soapbox, I'm not going to be happy until I see them locking up all the board members at Goldman Sachs and all these other banks. But the funny thing is, once they get locked up, then I'll be going, oh, they're prisoners. Oh man, we're going to send you some Dharma books, and hey, homie, come on, let's go hang out. But, until they get locked up, they're wearing these suits, and they live in the Hamptons, and they have their big yachts, and I'm really pissed off at them, and I'd like to see them in jail. So it's kind of funny that way how it could completely flip my attitude towards the same human being, right? I have absolutely no sympathy for them right now at all. And as soon as they get locked up, I would have all the sympathy in the world for them. So, so what is going on with this resurgence of white nationalism? Possibly you've got a bunch of white folks that are scared to death. They don't understand what's going on. They feel they're being disadvantaged. They feel like they're losing their culture. They think America used to be a white Christian country. It never has been completely a white Christian country, but they think that, and they think it's disappearing in front of their eyes. And this country in 2 generations, I don't know how long it'll take, it may be like a Latin country, right? This may be just like South America in 2 generations, right? And it may be a Spanish-speaking continent. And a lot of people probably aren't going to be happy about that, These cultural, evolutionary, social changes are painful for everybody. So these folks don't understand. They think, multiculturalism and liberalism and, everything's changing in front of their eyes, and, all these cultural changes that most of us who are progressives feel really good about the Marriage Equality Act, and, all the kinds of liberation are happening, and they're like, what happened? And they're freaked out. And we wish they would, take a chill pill and, try to educate themselves and not show up with their hate speech. But, basically they're freaked out human beings. So is the answer coming out as clubs, as progressive leftist counter-protesters? And I don't know. I'm not saying it's not. Anybody that goes out and is willing to stand up against hatred, I really admire. I'm just not sure that, on the one hand, it kind of, what some politically was able to happen was some people were able, and Trump was guilty of that. They kind of equate, okay, left and right, they're all violent, they're all crazy. There's terrorism on both sides. You got these young people, they're being violent, and it just creates a. Whereas we all know, when we've had the wonderful nonviolent movements that we've had with Gandhi and Martin Luther King and so many others, and that you claim that moral high ground, and the people who are acting really violently and from a place of hatred and division, it's really, really obvious that they are the ones creating the pain and suffering, while other people are silently bearing witness and protesting and suffering and being willing to suffer through civil disobedience and so forth. That's more my bent. I want to acknowledge my bias towards nonviolent civil disobedience, and the willingness to suffer in that way. But, I'm not. Again, I don't know what the answer is, and maybe sometimes things get bad and you just got to take a stand. If things got really bad, how many of us would take up arms if it got bad enough? If we got invaded, or, Mr. Trump turns the country over to Putin, and the Russians are here suddenly, maybe we join guerrilla groups and take up arms. I don't know what we do. I don't know what I would do. But I would certainly try not to lose my humanity in the process, which I know is what we all are very concerned. We don't want to lose our humanity, and at the same time we don't want to tolerate hatred, and we don't want to tolerate racism and bigotry and oppression of all kinds. And so and the thing is that it's becoming more and more difficult to be on the sidelines, right? It's becoming, I think, more and more difficult to be on the sidelines, which is probably a good thing, probably a good thing. And, I really don't think we have the luxury of being on the sidelines anymore. The other thing I'd like to say, and I want to open this up to some dialogue here pretty quickly, is that the whole thing that's going on right now, with whatever levels of cultural conflict and warfare we still have going on in our country, much less the rest of the world, but just in our country, and the racism and sexism and oppression and prejudice and bigotry and hate that's still present, and the suffering that's imposed on people just because of their gender expression or their skin color or their socioeconomic status in this country or what have you. The climate change stuff, you know, the president that we have right now, you know, the whole thing. It's very easy to feel like it's coming from somewhere else. Like, who do we get to blame for this? I mean, who do we blame? You know, I like to blame Wall Street. That's my favorite, the bankers, you know. And, you know, we can blame the corporations. We can blame the Republicans, or if we're Republican, we can blame the Democrats, or we can, you know, we can throw the blame all over the place. But you know, and that's really how I ended up being an outlaw and justified living as an outlaw in South America all those years. You know, I got into this very solid us versus them thinking I had lots of people to blame. You know, Nixon and the whole, you know, the whole system was completely corrupt and hypocritical. And, you know, myself, I remember Allen Ginsberg. Some of you may know of Allen, the famous beat poet, who was involved with Shambhala to a degree off and on, and at Naropa University where I studied and also taught. And anyway, I read some article or something, interview with, I think it was an interview with Allen at one point, and he was talking about, you know, that era of the beats, you know, in the 1950s, and, you know, that they were, he felt like in some ways they were the conscience of 1950s America. And some of you I see are old enough, not all of you, but some of you are old enough to have been around then. Probably the most repressed, stifling, bizarre time you could ever imagine in America. I mean, everything was like linoleum and chrome and plastic and processed food, and mothers were being told not to nurse their babies. And I mean, it was like, you know, this post-World War II, you know, everybody had bomb shelters in their yards, and it was conform at all costs, you know, conformity, and it was, of course, you know, the counterculture exploded out of that naturally. Why did I bring that up? I remember what thread I was on now. But, huh? Oh, Ginsberg, right. So Ginsberg was saying, you know, the beats were like this was just an honest person, an honest man, or an honest person, an honest woman. This is, you know, was the expression of the conscience of speaking, you know, out, a rationally intelligent, honest person. That was the expression coming out of the beat generation. And so they asked him, well, what about now? What's going on? And this was like in the 70s or something. And he said, I don't know what, you know, an honest human being would be doing now. I don't know. They'd probably be a drug smuggler. And I went, yeah, you know. I got all this validation out of that, you know, because I was actually still a drug smuggler at that time. Thanks, Alan. But at any rate, you know, it's very easy to get into all these us versus them logics and enemy making and then justify whatever we're going to do. And, but on the other hand, I don't think we can just sit back and hope the whole thing will go away either, right? So I think we all are really called to stand up and realize that there is no them. That this is, you know, many people have often said, you know, you've probably heard this phrase, when we have this leader, that leader. Well, we have the president that we deserve. You know, I think this is a blip right now. Again, I said I wasn't going to demonize Mr. Trump, but it's a little hard to stay away from that territory altogether. But, you know, I tend to think this is a blip. I think the country is overall becoming more progressive. You know, the demographics and the generation and overall the country is becoming more progressive, and I think this is a temporary blip. But nonetheless, you know, even, you know, we had George Bush for 8 years, and every time I looked at the screen, I couldn't believe it. Now my heart would sing if he was up there on the TV and, you know, oh, there I go again, you know. But, you know, you know, we have the, we have the, we have exactly what we have co-created. Now, we might go in and go, well, I didn't do anything to co-create. I'm not part of that, and I'm a victim of that, and I'm the one, but, it's very understandable, and very understandable to feel that way, because we're all tender-hearted human beings, and we're all vulnerable, and we all get afraid, and we all need to belong, and, we can create a lot of identity around being one part of one, identified victim group or another. And, these white nationalists, they think they are a victim group. That's their whole thing. They're coming out of a complete victim mentality with their aggression. They feel they're the losers in what's going on. They're being victimized. And so it's very easy to do that. But basically, collectively, I think we have, the only way out for me is that we can all say, okay, there is no them, this is us, this is where we're at as humanity, this is the best we've been able to do so far. And it ain't so bad, actually. Now, that may sound crazy, but you may have read about the research, I can't remember his name right now, but very credible research, long-term research that's been done, that actually makes it very clear that as a human race, we are less violent than we've ever been. Hard to imagine, because the news, we're so aware of everything that goes on, and, of course, it's probably related to per capita violence across the world, but we are actually becoming less violent as a human race. And nonetheless, obviously, we have a lot of challenges, and now the whole environmental thing. And so it's us. And each one of us every day, we get out of bed, and we're either, to use kind of old cliche, we're either part of the problem or part of the solution. And when we turn away, or we go to sleep, or you just want to close our eyes, or get numbed out with consumerism, which we all are to a degree, then we're part of the problem. And I think that's another thing to keep in mind, that we have all been deeply trained to be consumers. Deeply trained to be consumers. And we have just enough prosperity, wherever we are in this country. I mean, even if we're at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, in this country, we're better off than a lot of people are in the rest of the world. And, we have access to, almost everybody has access to some kind of entertainment, something to consume, right? And it keeps us asleep, it keeps us dead, it numbs us out, right? And we've all been trained to be consumers. And so we either like what's going on or we don't like what's going on. I like the government, I don't like the government. I like that part, I don't like, I like, I'm against, I'm for, I like, I'll buy that, I won't buy for that. I'll turn on that channel, I won't turn on that channel. I'll watch that channel, I won't watch that channel. I'll go here, I won't go there. We're basically, even the way that we engage is like to consume or not consume. And I think we really have to wake up to how deeply, even neurobiologically, we've been trained to be consumerist automatons. And if we don't use our reflective practices, our meditation practices, to develop really powerful insight, our activism, our engagement will just become another kind of shadow of that consumerism that we've all been deeply trained in. So I think we have to really think, how can we collectively step out of this and own not only our present reality, as our shared reality as human beings, own the present and own the future together, so that we can collectively create something different. Okay, so enough from me. I'd like to hear from you. Let's see what's on your minds, and I hope if I've stirred up anything, that would be great to bring out. So, do we have a microphone we can pass around?
So could you repeat the questions when people ask?
Yeah, okay, I will. I'm going to repeat your questions. And by the way, this is being audio taped and videotaped, and we will get this available. It'll be on my website, it'll be on the Milwaukee website. We'll get it out so you have access to it. But we'd rather have it out in a well-recorded form than on Instagram from somebody's iPhone. Although that's very undemocratic of me. I should probably, put it all out there on Instagram. Get everybody's iPhone and put it all out there. I'm just not with it. I'm not hip enough yet. I never will be. It's too late for me. Yeah. I saw news. I was looking at CNN the other night, and on my iPhone, and I was actually trying to see what was going on with Irma, And you know, they have all this Irma this, Irma that, Irma that, and then they had this one thing that said, is this appropriate? Instagram models responding to Irma. I go, what? You know, and so I had to look at it for a second. There's I didn't even know there was such a thing as Instagram models, but there's a whole new realm of celebrity models who I guess put their, you know, themselves on Instagram in, you know, scant clothing mostly probably, but they're legitimate models supposedly. But Instagram, I never even looked at Instagram. But Instagram, I guess, is a major cultural phenomenon. And now people have, you know, people have major careers just based on being on Instagram. I mean, we live in a very weird world. Anyway, okay, yes.
Well, one thing I've been reading about and watching on YouTube lately, and people are writing about it, is the phenomenon, I hate to say this, but the evangelical segment of our society, and how they subscribe to a whole nother paradigm of the world than we do, and it's maybe not reality based, and how can you ever reach them and have compassion for them, I guess, when there's no way they're gonna budge and look at science and, you know, the rest of it.
What do you think? How do we work with that?
I have a whole family of them, and I haven't been able to.
Yeah.
I guess you meditate and feel compassion in your heart, but it sure would be nice to see them enter the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when you think of it collectively, it's kind of difficult, and then it's, you know, we tend to lump it all together. I think there are evangelicals who are dyed-in-the-wool, kind of anti-science, you know, creationist and the whole thing, and what, you know, they would argue we're wrong, but most of us probably think that there's no basis for their view, but not all evangelicals are that way. And there's actually, I became aware in prison of two evangelical groups. They're pretty well organized, and they're theologically conservative, Christian, you know, evangelicals, but very progressive socially. They're like leftist evangelicals, if you can imagine such a thing. Yeah, they're very, and they were really standing up to a lot of stuff and involved in a lot of issues, and they were evangelicals. So, you know, we tend to, I think the first caution is not just lumping people into and realizing that every individual human being is on a spectrum of different things somewhere, and they're, you know, it may feel like they're really locked into that identity, but, you know, any one individual could step out in a moment. And people do leave those churches and leave, you know, people who were raised in those churches and super active people who've been pastors in those movements suddenly have some kind of, something happens and they step out of it completely. So, you know, nothing is as solid as we think. So I think it's helpful. First thing I think is to see things a little more fluidly, and to see, you know, we're all, as human beings, we're all day long, 24/7, basically trying to get our needs met, right? Food, warmth, shelter. What else? What are some other needs we share? Huh? Relationship, connection to others, being part of, inclusion. We also have a need for autonomy, self-agency, right? We have a need for respect, for love, you know, connection, we have all these needs. So the folks you're referencing, they're getting a whole lot of their needs met by being part of that identity group and part of that belief system at the moment. So they're a human being with a tender heart who, you know, we all are very fragile, basically, and we start off as these fragile little beings, and we're forced to separate from the safety of the womb and a kind of unitary state with our mother or primary parent, surrogate caregiver, and we're forced to start to develop an individual self-identity to survive in the world. And we do that, the alternative to not doing that is black hole of emptiness, like being dropped out of a spaceship. So we start building a self-structure out of whatever's around, right? But the whole thing's very dicey, and even, you know, if we grew up in a very loving, stable family, then we're going to have a much more functional self. But it's still fear-based, the whole construct. And even really successful, highly functional people who have not done any contemplative or psychological deep work, they're basically still living what Thoreau called lives of quiet desperation, somewhere back in the brain waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? And those of us who are not so functional, we more readily get into spiritual work, right? Because we know it's not working. Or we get into 12-step work and psychotherapy and all the rest of it, but we know there's a problem. So, but anyway, the whole thing is, if we can see the fluidity of the whole thing, and that we see, okay, here's a person, I don't agree with anything they believe or they're saying, and I actually think the fact that their beliefs exist and exert some influence on the culture is not a good thing, but basically here's a human being with a tender heart that somehow is, their life circumstances have led them to believe, probably unconsciously for the most part, that this is how I can best get my needs met, right? And they're safe there. And so I think that's the first thing. I do a lot of consulting work in organizations and businesses. And I've learned that when I come, and I tend to work with smaller companies. I've worked in big companies, but it's tough because it's such a big system, and you're in, you're out, you don't know if you have any influence. I like working with smaller, privately held companies where I can get my arms around the whole thing. Companies with anywhere from 50 to 150 employees. And I love doing that work. And what I've learned over many years of trial and error is I have to get in touch with the heart of that organization before I can bring about any change. And the heart may be held collectively, or it may be held by a few individuals, but I have to find it and get it to feel safe. Because if I don't do that, it will spit me out. And it's going to try to spit me out anyway, because any collective resists change, right? And so it's always going to try to spit out the change agent. And but if you don't find some way to create safety, there's no way change is going to happen. So what would it take? You have family, right? What would it take for them to feel safe enough around you to even maybe express some misgivings that they may have about their thing, which they would never share with you because they don't feel safe enough to, maybe they don't feel safe enough to even acknowledge it to themselves, but it's there, right? To move into that space of not knowing and uncertainty, because they're getting a lot of their needs met by being in this, I know the truth, right? But they're human beings, they have a brain, they have intelligence, so they have uncertainty. But they're not going to go there unless they feel really safe, right? Is that making sense?
Kind of. I want to say this guy, Frank Schaefer, he came from a family of, real hardcore fundamentalism. I forgot what his father's name is. Maybe somebody knows. But he's got a YouTube right now, and he's one of these that you said where he left that and became more progressive. And he was miserable being in that lifestyle because the real world didn't make sense to him.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's out there with a, 3-minute video saying, give up on them, they're crazy. So
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like being a reformed drunk. Sometimes it doesn't look so pretty for a while. There's a guy who I think is doing really good work, who's somebody here from the Shambhala Center, who's the fellow in Minneapolis who was involved in a neo-Nazi group of some kind and left and wrote a book, and now he works with young kids in Minneapolis. He's from Milwaukee, right? Huh? Yeah. Right, and so I think he's similarly, he woke up involved in that one of these hate groups, and he woke up and he got out of it. But I think he has a much more contemplative view about the whole thing. I don't think he's saying go kill all those people I was involved with. I think he has a much more less dualistic view about it.
Well, we also have Charlie Sykes. Charlie Sykes.
Yeah, I don't know Charlie Sykes.
He had a very popular radio program, and
Yeah.
very, very Republican, very
Right.
right-wing. And since Trump has gotten in, he has completely changed. He no longer has the radio program, and he's become a progressive.
Wow, there you go.
It's
Can
pretty
always happen.
amazing. I mean,
Yeah. Well, who would have thought a few years before the Berlin Wall came down that it would ever come down? Seemed impossible. I mean, maybe Rush Limbaugh will. I saw his picture. There was something in the news about he has a big mansion in Florida somewhere, and he was on a show talking about how this whole thing, it's a hoax. They're just, it's the media is perpetuating this thing about the storm so they can make money, and they're in cahoots with all the retail stores that people are running out to buy all this stuff. And he was, he was calling it fake news, this whole thing they like to do. And then it was, he actually had to, he evacuated, And he wouldn't admit that he was leaving because of the storm. He said, well, there's certain legal issues that I'm not really allowed to broadcast, so I'm leaving for parts unknown, and I'll be back on the air from somewhere next week, But I was looking at the picture they showed him. He looks so miserable, I mean, he just looks like such an unhappy human being. Yeah. But I'd love for him to become happy, because he'd probably be much happier if he became a progressive. Yeah. Yeah.
in Charlottesville, and seeing them in this duality way, you said, I believe, in terms of seeing them as people with basic goodness, fear-based, and then later discuss the Wall Street bankers and say you have no sympathy for them.
Right.
So
I was being a little bit, tongue in cheek, right? I do. I try to see them the same way, but they piss me off more than the guys in Charlottesville, only because they're so much more powerful. I mean, these guys, really, I could be wrong, but I think the best strategy in terms of these, guys that are coming out to protest, taking the statues down, is just to kind of laugh, because they're going to go away. They're not like, they're not some super organized, powerful, and I could be wrong, but I really don't see that emerging as a sophisticated, powerful terrorist movement. It's just not in the, yeah. But the bankers, they're serious. They're serious folks. That's why I'm a little more, focused there. But, of course, the same. The non-dual part is they're all human beings. They all have basic goodness, and they all have tender, vulnerable hearts. And the way they've chosen to not feel their vulnerability is creating a lot of problems, right? And so on the relative sense, we have to figure out how to relate with them and how to try to end up managing the damage, stopping the damage, turning them around, whatever we have to do relatively. The non-dual view doesn't mean what they're doing is okay. It just means we're gonna approach how to invite them to change from a less demonizing perspective.
So I guess then my question then, which is partially answered here, would be kind of, where is the line? Is there no line? Is it regardless, see that basic goodness, that kind of, like, regardless of the transgression that might have been caused against you or a specific group, and then like you talked about nonviolent response, and
Yeah.
so where's the line where response is necessary? Where's the line where you should just focus on yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a general theme of tonight's, where, I don't know if there is a line, but, I was in Rwanda. We did several, I'm part of the, I mentioned before, I think the Zen Peacemakers. We've been doing bearing witness retreats at Auschwitz-Birkenau for 18 years now or something, and I go there every year. I'm going this November, and we usually, there's anywhere from 100 to 150 of us from all over North America and Europe, and Christians and Jews and Buddhists and Muslims and Native Americans and people from Africa, and we go together as a community, and we spend 5 days in the camps just bearing witness to the reality of what happened there, and in dialogue with each other and in process. It's a very intense work. And at some point, we managed to get in touch with some peacemakers in Rwanda and invited them to come to Auschwitz for a couple of years so we could figure out how they could figure out how to do a bearing witness retreat in their country that would make sense in terms of their culture and their country. So I was very grateful to have the opportunity to be involved with that. And I went to Rwanda twice, and we did 2 bearing witness retreats there. And both times we spent time with prisoners who were convicted. They call them génocidaires, a French term for genocide, convicted genocide killers. And at the second retreat, I remember we actually went out to a prison farm in the country, very isolated, and a lot of, they actually had to process over 1 million Hutu people who were accused of genocide against the Tutsis following the end of the genocide. And they used this restorative justice process and these courts kind of connected to indigenous African and Rwandan values, and they called them the Gacaca courts. And because they couldn't just lock up all the Tutsis are only about 8% of the population of southern Rwanda, so they couldn't lock up the whole country. They had to go on. So many of the people involved in the genocide who were willing to admit and own their crimes and say where the bodies were buried and so forth were given very light sentences and reintegrated into society. But the ones who wouldn't admit were sent to prisons, and some doing hard labor, some in the prison farms. And so anyway, we're at this prison farm, and we were sitting there with a group of about a dozen convicted genocidaires who've never been willing to, own it or admit it, and they're still serving time. And when I first sat down and looked at them, it was the first time I'd ever had this experience. I thought I was looking at the face of evil. I just shuddered. I thought I was looking at the face of evil. But as I stayed with them and then we began to talk, I realized I wasn't seeing evil at all. I was seeing fear. I was feeling this deep, deep fear in their eyes that was almost like, got into a sort of animal level of fear. The reptilian brain completely taking over. Like kind of what, if you've seen wild animals, or if you've ever been in the ocean and looked at a shark face to face, which I have, it's just this cold animalistic fear, and human beings can get that way, right? But as they relaxed and felt safer with us, their humanity came out and I saw what I'd been looking at was not evil, it was fear, right? So, in terms of, I don't think there's, I think we personally, this is my own opinions, I think we need to stand up and raise our voices and be willing to put ourselves on the line and even get out of our comfort zones and be willing to suffer, to stand up against hatred and violence and aggression and prejudice and racism, all these kinds of things. But I think, and sometimes we have to stop. I mean, if I see somebody, wailing on their kid, in a grocery store, I'm going to try to stop them, and I'm going to call security and call the police. I mean, sometimes we have to intervene and stop, I think we all have to trust our instincts of where and how do we stand up and what are the lines and so forth. But the thing is that I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that we all have to engage, and we all have to be willing to speak out. And in whatever forms we do, whether we go join a nonviolent protest, or whether we're writing to legislators, or whether we're contributing to campaigns, or we decide to get involved with a particular NGO or something, or whatever. But I don't think it's an option to stand by and be silent and just be freaked out. I think we have to engage. But I think if we realize that the people that we think are on the other side of the problem are a bunch of freaked out human beings who unfortunately have mostly unconsciously chosen strategies to feel safe that are not working for the rest of humanity, and ultimately we have to get them to feel safe enough to consider changing and to see another possibility. Yeah.
It's a great story about your time in Rwanda and the peacemaking, that dialogue, and changing your perspective. Do you think that happens in the United States surrounding the genocide that we're part of the founding of this country? The genocide
Yeah.
of Native American
Yeah.
slavery?
Yeah.
Do you know, is that dialogue happening, that kind of thing that you do in Auschwitz and Rwanda here in this country?
Well, very, very little. The Zen peacemakers, again, we've been wanting to do some bearing witness retreats both around slavery and the genocide of the native peoples in this country for a long time. And a very close friend of mine, he's also a Zen teacher, Roshi Genro Gaunt, who's been involved in this bearing witness work from the beginning, and who leads street retreats all around the world. Very close friend of mine. We do a lot of work together. He's been developing a relationship with Native people, Lakota people in Pine Ridge and Standing Rock and other places for a long time. And he's been studying in a really genuine way with Native American elders for like 20 years. So slowly building the relationship. And it was inviting Native American elders to come to Auschwitz. We've had with Auschwitz probably 7 or 8 times at least. And a couple of years we thought the retreat would happen. It didn't happen. And finally it did happen. There's been one big bearing witness retreat in the Black Hills, and then a smaller one. And then I haven't been able to go to either of them, heartbreakingly so, because I teach at Santa Fe, at the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe every August. I have been for 18 years, and it's a very important work there. It's a socially engaged Buddhist training center in the same lineage as the Zen Peacemakers. And they've managed to choose the same dates every year for this thing, but I hope I can go soon. But anyway, this year they didn't do a big full-blown retreat, but they had 1 week where people who wanted to went up and worked as volunteers, helping to repair and build homes and do other things. And then another week that was kind of a small bearing witness retreat. So that is going on. It's very small scale, but it's begun. And it's basically, they wanted to do it in a way that the event was organized and hosted and mainly directed by the Native Americans, with some input of this bearing witness model. And the first one that they did on a fairly large scale, there were several hundred people there, was pretty successful and wonderful. So that's beginning. There's another group who are involved in trying to envision a bearing witness retreat around the issue of our history of slavery in this country. And there's I don't know that much about it, but there's a plantation somewhere in Louisiana, I think, that has become kind of some sort of a museum to represent slavery and what that was all about. And so there's been some talk of making a relationship and maybe doing it there, doing the first retreat there. So there's a little bit of momentum starting to happen in that direction. And a friend of mine is doing a small bearing witness retreat. He's very involved in the food world and these pay what you can cafes and that kind of movement. And he's doing a bearing witness retreat somewhere in upstate New York that is around having to do with the history of African American farmers and their involvement in our whole agriculture system and so forth. So he's doing some kind of small bearing witness retreat there, having something to do with that. I don't know that much about it. But anyway, there's and it's, we've never dealt with slavery in this country, and, we've never dealt with the Native American genocide, right? I mean, if we actually acknowledge it, then we'd have to do some kind of reparation. I mean, just imagine the scale of it. So, the powers that be have been resisting anything like that for a long time. But I think it has to happen. For this country, for America to have the promise that it has, we can get really negative about America. I got, where I hated being a white person, I hated being an American, and I left for South America, and I was just really, I was disgusted with the whole thing. I don't know that that's so helpful. America has a lot of promise. It's done a lot of positive things in the world. It's done a lot of terrible things in the world, and we're not the people with the white hats like we portray ourselves to be, or the good guys or good girls. But we also offer a lot of promise in it, and there is something about the American experiment that, and now it is the ultimate multicultural experiment on Earth right now. There's no one that's going through and dealing with the mix of ethnic and racial and religious cultures in such a progressive way as America. It's starting to happen in other places, in Europe, other places, but they're nowhere near where we are. And for just virtue of evolutionary force, we're having to deal with it. Some people very willingly, and other people not so willingly. But it's a great experiment. And so I think we have to keep engaging from that perspective of having a long view of what we're involved in as human beings, and trust that that if we don't have faith in our essential goodness as human beings, it's going to be hard to create a better world, because we're just going to fall back into fear. I don't really trust myself on a deep level when push comes shove, and I certainly don't trust those folks, and so I'm going to fall back into my fear-based strategies of how to survive. Take care of me, take care of my family, survive at all costs, and that's how we're going to keep perpetuating the world we have. Way in the back there, and then we'll come up here and then over there.
What happens at a bearing witness retreat?
Well, thank you for that question. I've been kind of just putting that out there without saying much about it. The Zen Peacemaker work, we ground it in three principles that we call the three tenets. And they are not knowing, bearing witness, and what has been called at one time healing, and then loving action, compassion action. Now, the founder of the Zen Peacemakers, Bernie Glassman, a renowned Zen master and social activist, being a Zen guy, he likes to deconstruct everything continually. So now he wants to call it third tenet just the actions that arise out of not knowing and bearing witness. Doesn't want to qualify it in any way, right? But that's just Bernie. He's a Zen guy. But at any rate, not knowing is the idea of letting go of fixed ideas about ourselves and others. Easier said than done, right? Suzuki Roshi talked about beginner's mind. Sung San Im, the Korean Zen teacher, talked about only don't know mind. So this is a core Zen idea. It's a Buddhist idea as well, of non-conceptual mind, letting, and not just a Buddhist idea, but I think all the great spiritual and contemplative traditions the world over have all been, how do you get out of conditioned mind? How do you get out of that conditioned mind into direct, naked experience of reality as it is? Much easier said than done, because we're psychologically conditioned, we are neurobiologically conditioned, and it doesn't go away through wishful thinking. So how do you get into that open mind, into that open state, right? And then, so to whatever extent we can do that, and most of the contemplative practices of the world's great religions and philosophical traditions and indigenous traditions are all about that. For me, they're all about how to get out of conditioned mind. And so to whatever extent that we can do that, then bearing witness is being willing to stay, not run away, to face the joy and suffering of life just as it is, in all its rawness. Not run away physically, not run away into a philosophy, not run away into some box of, political identity, or I'm the victim and they're the oppressor, or I'm the oppressor and they're the victim, whatever, Not that all that stuff isn't there, but not running away into all these boxes, but staying in the rawness of life, just as it is, without the protection of our knowing. Because we always go back to our knowing for we're meaning-making machines. We need constant reference points. We started off, as I said before, in this fragile state where we're going to grab onto whatever is there to create a self and have some reference points so I know who I am and who you are and what the deal is and how I survive. That's the human condition. That's what we all do, right? And we put that together. And if we go up around chaos, we put ourselves together out of that. I grew up in chaos in an alcoholic family, and I'm addicted to chaos. I'm terrified of it, but I'm addicted to it. That was the story of my life. And it doesn't drive my life now the way it did for years. But, so people, whatever, we see, we see how these lineages of abuse and dysfunctionality get passed on because it gets imprinted so deeply when we're, right? So it's a real challenge to relax that and really stay with the rawness of how things are. And the magic of the three tenets is that by doing so, we get in touch with the natural wisdom of things as they are. Sometimes I like to call it the wisdom of reality. And then we're able to respond in a way that doesn't come from our agendas, our belief systems, our preconceived ideas, but it's a natural, human, compassionate, wise response to what's actually going on right now, right? And the reason I feel it works, my pet theory about why it works, and humans have discovered this in lots of traditions and people all over the world and have called it under different names. The Zen Peacemakers named it in this way as the three tenets. Trungpa Rinpoche, the founder of Shambhala, talked about it as non-conceptual mind. Through non-conceptual mind, finding your seat, taking your seat properly, then holding your seat, that's the bearing witness, and then holding space for others, which is the quality of compassion and love. Right? Very similar idea. So, to the extent that we're able to relax in the not knowing and not run away, there's a connection between reality as it is and our own basic goodness. And when basic goodness connects with actual reality, I think what you get is wisdom-based action quite naturally. That's my theory about how it works. But anyway, so bearing witness retreats are a training ground to do that because we put ourselves in environments where our conditioning doesn't hold up anymore. Like Auschwitz is an amazing artifact because the Poles did a great job of preserving what was there and presenting it so people can go there. And you know, a lot of people just come in, they arrive on buses, they go in for 2 hours, they'll go back out. I don't know, you know, a lot of them just have an experience of fear. They bring a lot of school kids and they're kind of giggling, they don't know how to relate to it. They bring Israelis there by the busloads and busloads and busloads, and they wrap themselves in Israeli fed, and they increase their fear and build up, you know, what that. But we go and we stay, and we stay, and we stay. And when you stay there like that, you can't put it in a box anymore. It breaks down all your boxes. You know, you go and think, okay, I'm clear. I'm a good person. Those were the Nazis. They were the bad people. The Jews were the victim, and the homosexual and gypsies were the victim. And I, you know, and you stay there, and really, it's pretty soon you don't know whether you're a victim or you're a Nazi, or you know you're capable of all of it, and you're just staying and staying and staying. And eventually, your reference points for who you think you are just dissolve, and you find yourself in this place of not knowing. Similar idea with the street retreats. We go out on the streets with no money. That originally some people go, isn't that really exploitative? Well, on the outside it might look like it could be that way, but go on a street retreat and you'll find out it's different than that. But you're there, and you know, after you're out on the streets for a few days, and you suddenly realize the world ain't looking at you anymore like you belong to that club, you suddenly experience what women have experienced, people of color have experienced, homeless people have experienced that invisibility, or you experience their derision or their fear being projected at you, and that's a real awakening. And you know, so it's, you know, I haven't been to India yet. I was hoping to go with India with a couple of buddies this February, and it's not happening. I'm not happy about it, so I'm trying for 2019 because I've wanted to go for a long time. But everything I've heard about going to India, you get off the plane and you know you're going to be in not knowing because it is so culturally different. You know, you're going to be in some kind of cultural shock. So not bearing witness retreats are intentionally putting ourselves in an environment where our knowing falls apart, and we have the possibility of being in not knowing, and then we can train ourselves how to learn to be more comfortable with that place of not knowing and approach our lives more from that place of not knowing. I think I wanted to, you've had your hand up for a long time.
This is kind of an odd way maybe to state my question in the Shambhala Center, but just to back up from all the detail of what's going on and say that there's light and there's dark in more of a shamanistic perspective, and that these are like what's going to balance in the end, what's happening. And so from my vantage point, it's a revolutionary time, and to hold a position of being more light, love and compassion in all moments, but at the same time being like totally human, and sometimes feeling really naive. Am I kidding myself that everybody has a basic kindness? Because I do see it in most everyone, but faced with, you know, like you said, you face these people and you saw just the dark or the evil, and then it arose.
Yeah.
And the kindness came because you held that brighter light. Darkness is just the absence of light, and so you kept shining the light till it got through. And I don't know how we deal with that feeling naive and feeling like, am I just a nut job? You know, I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but sometimes I feel that, like this work is.
Yeah, I think so. And a lot of you know, activists who get into the more kind of aggressive kind of activism would say a lot of us are naive if we're, you know, wanting to maintain nonviolence and things like that. I'll tell you one little anecdote. During my 14 years in prison, I had this little project going on for quite a while because I'm from Missouri, the Show Me State, and you know I had a good rational, skeptical education, and so I'm kind of skeptical by nature. And so I've always, you know, liked the idea of basic goodness and kind of sort of believed in it, and you know, but I was always still had my skepticism, right? So here I am in this maximum security federal prison, and I had this little experiment going on to see if I could find somebody that actually didn't have basic goodness. Probably not the best thing to do, but I had time on my hands. And you know, and there were a lot of good candidates there, both among the guards and among my fellow prisoners. There were people that seemed like, you know, their agenda all day long was nothing but make everybody around them as miserable as they possibly could. And they looked pretty miserable themselves usually, and full of anger and hatred and bitterness. And some of them, and so I kind of, it was an informal participatory research kind of thing. But it was serious. And every time when I finally thought I had my man, this was a male prison. I mean, there were some women there were actually over time more and more women on the staff, but it was usually the males on the staff that were the worst. But anyway, when I thought I'd found my person, finally I found the person, I proved that there are people without basic goodness. Inevitably, they would in some way reveal their humanity to me. It happened every time in some of the most bizarre, remarkable ways. And so over time, I developed this really strong experiential faith in people's basic goodness. Now, having said that, I was in Rwanda, and I listened to countless stories. And when we're bearing witness, a gentleman actor asked what we do. We spend a lot of time listening. Every year in Auschwitz, we read, and the new people who come for the first time, they hear from the guides, and they go through the whole thing. But then we've always had survivors with us. Now, there's not that many survivors left anymore, but we've always had survivors with us. And so we listen to stories, and people... And we get together and people talk about their family members, because a lot of people that come on the retreat have a family connection to the Holocaust and to Auschwitz in particular. So we do a lot of time listening. And in Rwanda, we listened and listened and listened and listened to survivors. And survivors who watched their own family members being butchered right in front of their eyes, it's hard to even take it in sometimes. And I try to imagine myself being in that situation when that was happening. Now, I am pretty certain that I'm not spiritually advanced enough to be in that situation when it was happening and see the basic goodness of the people that are doing it. I'm pretty confident that I don't have that level of spiritual advancement. Now, I got to spend a day with, there was a gathering of former prisoners, about 15 of us, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama in New York about 10 years ago. And we spent, along with in dialogue with each other, and we spent 2 or 3 hours in dialogue with His Holiness, which was great. But we also spent quite a bit of time with these 2 Tibetan nuns and 1 Tibetan man, who'd all spent about 6 years each in Dropchi prison, one of the infamous Chinese communist prisons in occupied Tibet. And, they spent 6 years being tortured mostly. The 2 young Tibetan nuns, they were even young when we were there. They were probably in their 30s or something, late 30s. And they, were bearing witness, telling us the whole story of and they've been thrown in because they refused to denounce the Dalai Lama. And the guy, the man was a Canadian citizen of Tibetan origin who was in Tibet as an ethnographer doing research to try to collect Tibetan folklore so it wouldn't be lost. But he got grabbed off the street and accused of being a spy and thrown in prison. So all 3 of them, we spent hours listening to their stories. And they were doing this around the country and bearing witness so people would see this is going on in Tibet. This is what the Chinese are doing in these prisons. So to raise awareness, so maybe people would raise enough voice that it would make a change. But you could tell they were completely free of demonizing their captors or the people that were torturing them. And you can't fake that, right? And they may have had their moments. I'd be surprised if they didn't. But these folks were raised from birth in a culture that just, it's compassion, 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 compassion. If you know anything about the Tibetan people and Tibetan Buddhism, it's just compassion, 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 loving kindness, loving kindness. And that's just in their bones and in their hearts. And they were able to get through that experience without falling into, bitterness and hatred towards their captors. So, so I don't know, it's all tough, right? But rather than naive, I think not losing faith in humanity and in the basic goodness of humanity, I think is the ultimate stance of courage and bravery. And I think it takes a lot of guts, actually. Yes, right there, the gentleman there.
When you were speaking earlier about fear, there's intentionally sophisticated propaganda engineer a social consensus of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to find means to undo that, and make people aware of it. The most extreme state of fear is you feel, people can feel their own lives to be threatened, and they'll strike out in violence.
Mm-hmm.
And people that are motivated by power, one type or another, whether it be Madison Avenue or Joseph Goebbels, or whatever, they'll say anything, do anything. We're all engineered as a consensus to be consumers, as you said before.
Mm-hmm.
When we see propaganda of the social consensus of fear going on, there should be enough of us aware of it to maybe develop a way to combat that sort of thing, because
Yeah.
that seems to be the universal pattern of forming destructive mass movements.
I think you're right, precisely right. And as human beings, we either operate from vulnerability and openness or from fear. We're kind of designed that way. And, again, talking about light and darkness, for me, I don't, some people want to say, human beings have goodness, but they also have the seeds of evil, that it's kind of a toss-up which way it's going to go, and that there is evil lurking in the hearts of man and that kind of thing. I don't think we're innately evil. I think we're innately good. That's my opinion and my experiential belief and faith. But I do certainly think evil exists. And for me, what evil is kind of a more like a virus, a fear-based virus that gets passed around within human culture. And unfortunately, the more, every time there's war and genocide, every time there's child abuse and neglect, and people grow up under racism and oppression and extreme poverty, or they're abused or subjected to violence, or they're displaced in refugee, all this stuff just keeps adding to this collective load in our human culture of toxicity, of this load of trauma and oppression and toxicity, and it will always come out as rage and violence in all kinds of forms. So any idea that our human culture is going to improve without dealing with this, I think it is naive. And I think we have to figure out how to drain the swamp as much as we can, but really, drain this toxic load and heal, but also not drain the swamp Mr. Trump was talking about, which he clearly has not been doing, but but we really need to focus on the children and find non-coercive means for enculturating children, because even the most benevolent parents in our culture enculturate their children through coercive means. Whatever the parents buy into, whatever culture or group they're part of, or socioeconomic status or way of life or way of being, they want their kids to fit in, to be happy. So when they see their kids doing anything that looks like it doesn't fit, the fear comes in their eyes, they feel embarrassed, they feel afraid, and they subtly or not so subtly give the child the message: conform or you will be kicked out, conform or you will be rejected, conform, right? And that goes on with the most benevolent parents, and our education system is completely built on it. We have a shame-based, fear-based education system. So, there are models like the Montessori schools and the Steiner schools and other alternative methods where people are trying to figure out how to raise children in non-coercive ways. And I think that's a critical place where we have to put a huge amount of effort. And instead, we've got this school-to-prison pipeline phenomena where we have this fear-based public school system, and even private school system is not that better in many cases, that's conditioning kids to go to prison, right? And instead of parents being engaged in the education system, we have our schools full of police now. And we're turning, don't get me started. But we have a long way to go, and you're absolutely right. But in my view, when human beings have confidence in their basic goodness, we are naturally partnering, compassionate, kind, and caring beings. And there's tremendous research to prove this, modern neuroscience research to prove it, as well as huge amount of human history. Despite everything, the human condition is to be set up to lead a fear-based life. Despite all that, what do the vast majority of human beings do every day? The vast majority of human beings all over the planet get up every day and do the best they can to take care of themselves, take care of their kids, and to cooperate on some level so that socially we can coexist together. That's what we all do every day, you know? And so there's tremendous evidence that human beings are basically good. And when we're not fearful, we're naturally partnering, collaborative, caring, kind, and compassionate. When fear takes over, then, you know, anything can happen, right? And so politicians forever have learned to use fear. You know, we always have to have an enemy, whether it was the communists or the you know, drugs or the leftists or terrorism or, you know, or Republicans or Democrats or liberals or conservatives. I mean, we all, now, you know, you got the white supremacists and you got the black bloc, you know, and you got, you know, I mean, everybody wants to have an enemy, right? And huh?
How do we combat the propaganda?
Well, first of all, not buy into it ourselves. First of all, not buy into it ourselves, and be willing to be vocal about not buying into it, and be willing to suffer and be called naive for that, but to become more articulate. There's a great book that I would really recommend. There's two books I would recommend. Well, I'm just going to recommend one of them. The other one, I don't want to get you too depressed, but this one is more liberating. It's called Burning All Illusions. The author's name is David Edwards. And he basically describes, and it's research-based, based on a lot of research, and it shows what perpetuates the status quo. How does the mainstream status quo manage to stay, you know, going and going and going and going? And, you know, we all think it's like some conspiracy out of some back room with a bunch of old white guys smoking cigars somewhere. But he shows in his book you don't really need a back room with a bunch of old white guys smoking cigars, that the whole process happens much more organically. And it starts with these framing realities, which culturally in our country is free market capitalism, private property, growth is good, profit is good. You know, these basic things that if you speak out and concentrate those things, you are not in the mainstream. You are not going to be in the news. You're not going to work in a major corporation. You're not going to be on a TV network. You're not going to be on anything in a public sphere if you challenge that, right? So, and then there's all these other forces of economics and the news media and control of news media, and they show how we have this illusion of free media, and it's not that it's like somebody, it's all an organic process. And, you know, he shows how, you know, like the big banks, they get caught money laundering all the time for sanction busting, for gun running, for the drug cartels. I mean, Citibank, Wachovia, Wall Street, you know, they all get busted all the time. It's on the front page of the New York Times, but then it's on the 5th page, and then it's gone, right? And, you know, so we have this idea that everything, I mean, the CIA gets busted again and again, drugs and guns, right? It's in a newspaper, but it doesn't stay. Nothing has any impact unless it stays on the front page and stays on the front page. So they've actually done all this research to measure the column width in the newspapers and the amount of time on TV, and they've shown how all this stuff works and all the forces that bear on this. And it's really helpful to see all this. And I won't give away the last couple of chapters, but in the last couple of chapters, he actually talks about how we can liberate ourselves from this. Because it's the forces that create this kind of group think in which we think we're part of this free democratic society inside the parameters of this mainstream, which is not actually true. But that there is a way to liberate ourselves from it. And I'm not going to give away that. You have to read the book, but I've mentioned it tonight. I've already mentioned it tonight, and it is what he came to, that there's the way out. It has to do with not buying in, but there's a specific way that we manage to free ourselves from not buying in. And we may think we're not bought in. You could be like a hardcore activist, right? And you're just part of the thing. You're just another player on the chessboard that creates this whole illusion. You could be a Hell's Angel, a hardcore, dedicated Hell's Angel biker, and you're still just part of the whole thing, because it all fits. It all helps perpetuate the thing. But there is a way out. It's a great book, Burning All Illusions. Yes?
I'm a mom and I work with kids, and my daughter's 9 and she has a very fiery, intense personality. I mean, I do too, but I'm more quiet about it, I guess, now that I've grown up. And it sounds like they've kind of stayed away from the issues, you know, these issues at school. But she comes home and tells me about in 3rd grade of how all very deep conversations they're all having in the lunchroom, and are continuing to have in do this, people, and she doesn't understand why adults don't do more, and she's ready to jump in. I don't know how to talk to her about it, and I'm like.
Yeah, it's challenging. I think the main thing is just keep her safe and you know, and listen a lot. You know, listen a lot. Validate. If she's angry, you're angry. Yeah, yeah, I'm angry. Yeah, good. You know, just validate whatever she's experiencing. I think keep her safe and validate her, right? Yeah. You know, there's some research showing that this isn't the good news, that because of these things and all the rest of it, there's a whole generation growing up who have lower emotional intelligence and poorer relationship skills than any of us have had before. And it's our relationship skills that help us survive on this planet. Sakya Mipram Rinpoche, the author of, the spiritual leader of the Shambhala community worldwide, has a book coming out called The Lost Art of Good Conversation. And it's coming out in October. I encourage you to read it. It's a really important book, because if we lose the ability to talk with each other, things could get really bad. And in some ways, I think we have young people growing up who are less prejudiced and less racist and less biased in those ways than any generation ever, for the most part, unless they've grown up in some backwater or something. But at the same time, they're growing up with really terrible communication skills and terrible relationship skills and lower emotional intelligence, unless something intervenes or they wake up or happen to get into a good program or something somewhere because of all this digital stuff. And it's affecting their brains. So it's kind of scary.
She's disappointed about why adults are letting this happen, and she's feeling.
Yeah, and we are letting it happen because we're making money off it.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, you know, the violent video games that are out there. I mean, how can anybody, I don't care what religion they are or politic they are, that we really care about kids when we can't stand up and say, you know, these video games that kids watch of armed bank robbery and stealing cars, you know, these incredibly violent, you know, that's legal, you know. You may as well give, drugs, I don't see one as being any more dangerous than the other. It's all dangerous, but we do that. Why? Because nobody's willing to stand up against consumerism and the almighty dollar. And we're all allowing this to happen. We're all allowing this to happen. Last one. This will be the last one. It's getting late, so we better let y'all go. And tomorrow, just so you know, I don't know how many people are signed up for tomorrow, but tomorrow we're going to do a day that's going to be completely experiential. And we're going to go into experiential processes with each other in dyads and triads and small groups of really understanding the nature of victim consciousness and what does it really mean to radically own our own situation and radically participate in the world in a way where we're acknowledging all the suffering and validating people who are actually victimized, but we're not getting caught in that consciousness such that we just become, and understanding the nature of drama and the roles of how we get into triangulation of victim and persecutor and rescuers and not knowing and bearing witness and loving action. We're going to experientially go into this territory tomorrow in a really powerful way. So I'm looking forward to that. It's really juicy. So I just wanted you to know what we're doing tomorrow if you want to come. All right, last question, gentlemen in the back.
And that's actually what I was going to ask is how do we talk about conversation and we don't really talk about the differences in thought that we have nowadays very much.
Mm-hmm.
We don't talk about that we have a difference of opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we build that safety in the conversation? So we can have those talks about you believe this and I believe this, and we can have a conversation about it instead of yelling at each other
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. Well, tomorrow is going to be a skills training on how to do exactly that. And, you know, one really helpful thing that my Zen teacher, Bernie Glassman, does all the time, when he gives all his talks, I haven't been honoring that very well tonight, but he just says, everything he says, this is just my opinion. You know, I mean, he's a Zen, he's a famous Zen, he could get up and say, this is the way it is. He goes, so, no, this is my opinion. This is my opinion, man. And he's, you know, I think he may come out with a new book around that, but he's really emphasizing that today, that, you know, if we're willing to talk with each other and say, no, not this is the way it is, but this is my opinion, you know, it's much easier to have conversations. You know, we can be forthright. This is my opinion. I have reasons why I have this opinion. I'm willing to listen to your opinions, but I'm not saying this is how it is. You know, I used to train hospice volunteers in prison, and I would really try to get because we had people from all different faiths doing it, but I really tried to get the evangelicals trained, because they would, in these groups and other contexts, they'd always say, well, you know, Scripture says. And I would always poke them. I'd say, well, which Scripture? You mean the Bhagavad Gita or the Veda? Which one are you talking about? And they would like, you know. But, you know, I would try to train them that all they have to do is say, in my tradition, we feel this. In my tradition, it's similar to saying my opinion, right? I can listen to somebody. You can say, in my tradition, we do this or we think, and then I can listen. But when somebody says, the da-da-da-da, or Scripture says, you know, suddenly I'm like, well, what, you know? Because they're speaking from a context different from mine, as if that's the absolute truth. So it's helpful to just acknowledge that we all have opinions. And, you know, we hold some of them pretty tightly, and we think some of them are grounded in a lot of evidence. We maybe hold some a little less tightly, and it's probably good to hold them all pretty lightly, you know, because what do we really know, you know? And at the same time, that's not an excuse for not being able to speak up and stand up and, you know, have opinions either. Yeah, great. So that's probably a good place to end. I hope that this has been helpful in some ways to stir up a little thing and maybe give us a little courage to, you know, to find some way to engage and find some way to engage with some wisdom, you know, and wisdom could just be to engage and say, you know, I'm going to speak up, and it's my opinion, and I don't know if I'm right, but I'm following my heart, and I'm not speaking up to cause harm or to hurt you, but I'm going to speak up, and I'm going to say, I don't believe this is right. I think this is wrong. We need to raise our voices, you know, or it's just acknowledging it's our opinion, or, you know, really getting in deeply into our contemplative practice, as well as getting out in the public square and doing both together, so that we can find some way to do it without losing our humanity and not losing our heart, and just getting into more anger and more divisiveness, while at the same time honoring. If we're angry, we can get out and speak it, but not get lost in it, not turn it into a weapon against ourselves and others. Yeah. So I wish you all the very best. We're living in very uncertain and dicey times and scary times, and we all need to really come together and support each other. And I encourage you to find community and be part of, you know, find like-minded spiritual people, because to engage in this work takes resilience. And to have resilience, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual resilience, we need to take care of ourselves, we need to sleep, we need to eat well, we need to take care of each other, we need to have strong relationships, we need to have strong friendships, we need to do our contemplative practices, we need to get out in nature, we need to not do too much of the harmful, toxic stuff that's kind of fun, moderation and everything, but we need to take care of ourselves, you know, because we need resilience, because to stand up and be warriors in this world, we need strength. We need to believe in our own goodness, believe in others' goodness, but we also need to take care of ourselves to have the strength to show up and, you know, just keep showing up and showing up and showing up with our hearts open. I think that's a human challenge today, is to show up with our hearts open. So thank you very much. And thank you again, Alan.